Hey there, are you ready to lose yourself in a world of darkness and chilling tales? Go ahead, turn off the lights, put on your headphones, and let the shadows pull you in. If you're new here, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, and let me know in the comments when and where are you watching from. Let's see how far this darkness can spread. I used to live in the Brown Summit area of Guilford County, North Carolina. At the time, I was 17 years old, living with my stepmother and father in a rather nice neighborhood. My mother, on the other hand, lived outside of Reedsville, so I spent my weeks moving back and forth, staying with my mom during the week and my dad on weekends. Both areas were pretty quiet, almost boring to me back then, but I didn't mind too much. One thing that kept me entertained, though, was exploring the large piece of land my stepmother owned. I'm not entirely sure how many acres it was, but it was substantial, stretching well into the surrounding forest and even reaching a railroad track. My dad had made several trails cutting through the land, which made it a lot easier to navigate. Every weekend when I stayed with my dad, I made it a point to head out and explore those trails. Sometimes I'd bring my dog, Buddy, along for company. He was a big, friendly dog, always up for an adventure. But on this particular day, Buddy wasn't around. He was being groomed and washed, so I decided to venture out alone. It was a summer afternoon, somewhere between 3 and 4 p.m., and the weather was typical for that time of year, hot and sticky. It had rained recently, so the trails were muddy, especially near the main entrance where some logging work had left things uneven and messy. Still, I didn't mind. I loved being out there, walking the trails, and just soaking in the solitude. As usual, I spent hours wandering, taking my time to stop and rest on fallen tree logs, or even just sitting on the ground. There was something calming about being out in nature, surrounded by nothing but the sounds of the forest. I didn't have to think about anything, just me, the trees, and the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze. Eventually, I found myself on the main trail, a dirt road that ran straight and narrow, bordered by thick forest on both sides. In the middle of the trail were rows of power lines, stretching endlessly in both directions. The road itself was rough, uneven, and full of holes and trenches, but it was familiar to me. I'd walked it countless times before. By this point, it was close to 6 p.m., and the sun was starting to set, casting a warm, golden-orange hue over everything. As I stood there, taking it all in, I noticed something odd. Everything was quiet, unnaturally quiet. Normally, I didn't pay much attention to the sounds of the forest. Birds chirping, leaves rustling, distant animal calls. But the sudden silence was unsettling. It was like the whole forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Then I heard it. A loud, piercing shriek echoed through the trees, stopping me dead in my tracks. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. The sound was sharp and unnatural, a mix between a dying horse and a man screaming. It wasn't just one sound either. After the initial scream, there were 3 or 4 short, guttural snorts that followed, each one harsher than the last. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I'd just heard. I'd encountered strange sounds in the woods before. Foxes screaming, owls hooting, but this was different. This wasn't an animal sound I recognized. It was raw, primal, and deeply unnerving. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, trying to pinpoint where the noise had come from. It seemed like it was a few yards away, maybe deeper in the woods, but I couldn't be sure. my instincts screamed at me to move, to get out of there as fast as possible. Without thinking, I turned around and ran. Adrenaline surged through me, and I sprinted down the trail like my life depended on it. I didn't look back, didn't stop to catch my breath. I just ran. The uneven ground, the mud, the heat, I didn't care. My only thought was to put as much distance between me and whatever made that sound as possible. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually my body gave out. Somewhere near the logging area, I tripped and fell hard, landing face first in the mud. The fall knocked the wind out of me, and the sudden shock brought me back to reality. The adrenaline was wearing off, and I felt the full weight of exhaustion and fear. My muscles were cramping, and my clothes were soaked with sweat and mud, but I didn't care. I had to keep moving. Limping and dragging myself along, I made it back to the house. I didn't tell anyone about what happened. Not my dad, not my stepmom, not even my friends. I didn't know how to explain it, and honestly, I didn't want to relive the experience by talking about it. Even now, years later, I still think about that day. Sometimes it pops into my head at random moments, when I'm on the bus, walking home, or lying in bed at night. I've tried to rationalize what I heard. Maybe it was a hurt animal, caught in a trap or injured somehow. Maybe it was something else entirely. I don't know. What I do know is that I've never heard anything like it since, and I hope I never do again. When I was in middle school, I started dating this guy who I'm going to call Sorian. At first, he seemed really sweet, kind, caring, and attentive. He had this charm that made me feel special, and in the beginning, everything felt like a dream. But as the months went by, things began to change. About 3 months into our relationship, the cracks started to show. Sorian's behavior became increasingly erratic. He would get jealous over the smallest things and would constantly need reassurance. What started as sweet attentiveness turned into something more controlling and suffocating. By the time we hit the 4-month mark, the relationship had become unbearable. I realized I wasn't happy anymore, and it felt like we were always arguing or walking on eggshells around each other. The joy that had once been there was gone, and I knew I had to end it. Towards the start of our freshman year of high school, I finally worked up the courage to break up with him. It wasn't easy, but I felt a sense of relief once it was over. A couple of weeks later, though, Sorian and I started hanging out again as friends. At first, it seemed like it might work. We could put the past behind us and move forward without all the drama. But it didn't take long for me to realize that I didn't want someone as toxic as Sorian in my life, even as a friend. His energy was draining, and being around him just brought back all the negativity I'd worked so hard to escape. I made the decision to cut ties with him completely. Months went by, and I thought I was finally free of the whole ordeal. Winter break rolled around, and I was excited to have some time to relax and reset. Then, 3 days into the break, everything took a turn. It was late at night, probably around midnight or 1 a.m., when my phone started blowing up with messages from Sorian. At first, I ignored them, but he kept texting, begging me to let him come over. I repeatedly told him no, over and over again, but he wouldn't take no for an answer. His messages escalated, and eventually he just said, "I'm coming over." At that point, I was genuinely alarmed. I didn't want to deal with him anymore, so I blocked his number, hoping that would be enough to keep him away. Feeling uneasy but exhausted, I finally drifted off to sleep. Around 4 a.m., I was startled awake by the sound of loud, insistent pounding on my bedroom window. My heart was racing as I pulled back the curtain, and there he was, Sorian. He was standing outside in the freezing cold, snow falling all around him, staring at me through the glass. My stomach dropped. I couldn't believe he had actually shown up at my house in the middle of the night. I panicked and quickly let go of the curtain, rolling back onto my bed and pulling the blankets over me as if that could somehow make him go away. I lay there, frozen with fear, hoping and praying that he'd give up and leave. The pounding on the window continued for what felt like an eternity. It wasn't just scary, it was infuriating. Who did he think he was, showing up uninvited and disrupting my peace like this? Finally, after about 2 hours of relentless knocking, he gave up and left. I felt a mix of relief and disbelief. It was crazy to me that he had walked all the way to my house in those conditions. There was at least 2 feet of snow on the ground. It was still snowing heavily, and the temperature was well below freezing. It was a dangerous night to be outside, let alone walking long distances. Just when I thought the ordeal was over, my phone buzzed with a notification. I'd forgotten to block his sister, and now she was texting me, calling me crazy for not letting him in. She accused me of being heartless and leaving her brother out in the cold. I was so overwhelmed, worried, confused, and completely drained. I didn't even have the energy to argue with her, so I ignored the message and went back to bed, hoping I could finally get some rest. Looking back, the whole situation still feels surreal. It was a wake-up call for me about boundaries and recognizing red flags. That night, I realized just how important it is to trust your instincts and protect your peace, no matter what. During my teenage years, there was a place in my hometown called Hamlands. It was an expansive area of open fields and woodland that seemed to stretch forever, bordered by the river on one side. To the locals, it was a mixed bag of serenity and mystery. People often came here to walk their dogs, have campfires, or just enjoy the quiet escape from suburban life. But there was another side to Hamlands, a darker, more unsettling side that people whispered about but rarely confronted directly. It was known to be a popular spot for nudists during the summer, and the stories about peculiar encounters there were plenty. One story that stuck with me was told by a boy I knew. He described seeing a fully nude man riding a bike directly toward him, forcing him to flee in a panic. At the time, I dismissed his account as an exaggeration. After all, Hamlands was my go-to hangout spot with friends, a place that carried so many fond memories. It was hard to reconcile the peaceful image I had of the place with the idea of danger lurking there. One summer afternoon, my friends and I decided to visit the woods in Hamlands. The sun was shining, the day was perfect, and we were in high spirits. Armed with a picnic blanket and a spliff, we found a secluded spot deep in the woods and set up camp. The canopy of trees provided just enough shade, and the sound of leaves rustling in the breeze was oddly calming. Everything felt right in the world as we laughed and talked, enjoying the buzz of youthful rebellion. After a while, some of my friends decided they were hungry and announced they were heading to Tesco to grab food. It was only a short walk away, and I didn't think twice about staying behind with just one other friend. The woods felt like a second home, familiar and safe. What could go wrong? As the minutes passed and the stillness of the woods settled in, I began to notice odd things. At first, it was subtle. Clothes were hanging from the trees, seemingly random articles swaying gently in the breeze. A sock here, a shirt there. It didn't make sense. I mentioned it to my friend, who laughed it off, but I couldn't shake the unease that was slowly creeping in. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. There, crouching in the shadows of the trees, was a man. He was partially obscured by foliage, but it was clear he was watching us. His presence sent a chill down my spine. I turned to my friend, my voice low and urgent, and told her what I had seen. She looked in the direction I pointed, but didn't seem convinced. But when I turned back to look again, my blood ran cold. Emerging from the shadows was a tall, 6-foot-tall man, completely naked. He was holding a metal pipe in his hand, his expression unreadable, but his intent unmistakably threatening. He was only about 4 meters away, close enough for us to see every disturbing detail. For a moment I froze. The surreal nature of the situation hit me like a tidal wave. My brain struggled to process what I was seeing. Then instinct kicked in. Without a word, my friend and I grabbed our bags and the picnic blanket and bolted. We sprinted toward what I thought was a path, but it had become overgrown with thick thorns since the last time I'd been there. The branches clawed at us as we pushed forward, desperation overriding the pain of scratches on our legs and arms. Behind us, I could hear the faint sound of movement, and my heart pounded so loudly in my chest that I thought it might burst. At one point, we stumbled straight through a bee's nest, and the angry buzzing surrounded us. Thankfully, the picnic blanket shielded us from most of the stings, but the thorns continued to rip at our skin as we pushed forward. Every step felt like a fight for survival. When we finally emerged from the thicket and found ourselves back in the open field, we didn't stop running until we reached a nearby road. My legs felt like jelly, and my lungs burned, but the relief of being back in civilization was overwhelming. We flagged down a passerby and hurriedly explained what had happened, though our story sounded almost too bizarre to believe. To this day, I've never returned to Hamlands. The memory of that afternoon is burned into my mind, and the questions still haunt me. How long had that man been watching us? What were his intentions? And what would have happened if we hadn't noticed him when we did? The realization that there would have been no way to escape if he had decided to run after us sends a shiver down my spine even now. Ham Lands, once my sanctuary, became a place of nightmares in a single afternoon. That day taught me a lesson about the unexpected dangers that can lurk in even the most familiar places, and the importance of trusting your instincts when something doesn't feel right. About 9 years ago, my family and I were living in an extended stay hotel while searching for a new home. By that time, we had been there for quite a while, and had made a few friends among the long-term residents. Some of the people we met had been living in the hotel for over 10 years, which was both surprising and fascinating to us. The community there felt unique, a mix of people from different walks of life, all under one roof. One morning, my mom and I were relaxing in our room, still in our night clothes, watching TV. It was a quiet day, or so it seemed. We were used to the usual noises of the hotel, footsteps, occasional laughter, or kids running down the hallways. But that morning, a louder commotion caught our attention. It came from the hallway outside our room, but we shrugged it off, assuming it was just another argument or one of the hotel residents being a bit loud. Noise wasn't unusual in a place like this, so we didn't think much of it. Around 10:45 a.m., a loud knock on our door startled us. A voice announced, "Police!" My mom and I exchanged surprised looks. Every door in the hotel had a peephole, so we cautiously approached ours and looked out. Sure enough, a uniformed officer stood in the hallway. He was young, with a handsome and serious face, and his presence immediately made the situation feel more real. We opened the door just a crack, and he informed us in a firm but calm tone that there was a situation unfolding in the hotel. and that we needed to evacuate immediately. My mom and I were taken aback. What kind of situation could warrant this? We asked him what was going on, but he refused to give us any details. The urgency in his voice made it clear that we shouldn't waste time. Hurriedly, we told him we needed to get dressed. He urged us to move quickly, so we scrambled to throw on our clothes, slap on our everyday wigs, and grab our purses. We didn't know what we might need, so we just grabbed the basics and headed out. As we stepped into the hallway, the scene was chaotic. People were pouring out of their rooms, some in groups, others clutching bags or belongings. Some folks were already heading to their cars and driving away, while others milled around, looking just as confused and scared as we felt. Outside, the atmosphere was even more intense. A swarm of police cars lined the parking lot, their lights flashing in the daylight. Officers were everywhere, giving instructions and managing the growing crowd of evacuated residents. We were desperate for answers. Asking around, we got different stories from other hotel guests. One person mentioned a possible threat, while another suggested that someone was refusing to leave their room and might be causing danger. The conflicting rumors only added to our anxiety. As more time passed, the scene grew even more surreal. Special units arrived, their presence making it clear that this wasn't a minor incident. News crews started to gather at the scene, their cameras and reporters amplifying the tension. We stood outside the hotel, unsure of where to go or what to do. My mom and I didn't have another place to stay, and many others were in the same boat. Some people decided to leave and find other accommodations, while others, like us, stayed in the area, hoping the situation would resolve quickly. After hours of waiting, hunger set in. A kind neighbor we had befriended at the hotel offered to drive me to a nearby McDonald's for food. Meanwhile, my mom contacted one of my cousins who was at work, explaining our predicament. By hour 7, the standoff still hadn't ended. My dad had returned by then, joining us outside. We saw people sleeping in their cars, and some even stretched out on the grass, resigned to waiting. One man, who had just gone grocery shopping that morning, lamented that all his food had spoiled because he couldn't store it in the fridge. Another man, who needed to get to work, was eventually given a ride by the police themselves. Thankfully, my cousin left work early and came to our rescue. She took us shopping for overnight supplies, and we spent the night at her house. It wasn't until the next day that we learned the full story. According to the news, a young man and woman staying at the hotel had locked themselves in their room. Both had unresolved legal issues. The standoff lasted for a grueling 12 hours, with police trying to convince them to come out peacefully. Fortunately, it ended without violence, and the couple eventually surrendered. While it was a relief that no one was hurt, the incident had caused a significant disruption for everyone staying at the hotel. The inconvenience and fear lingered long after the police tape came down. For us, it was a day we wouldn't soon forget. A surreal and chaotic reminder of how quickly life can take an unexpected turn. Looking back, I'm grateful for the kindness of the people around us that day, from the neighbor who got us food to my cousin who took us in. It was a scary experience, but it brought out the best in some, even in the midst of uncertainty. Back before I became a custodian, worked at the local school district, and faced the infamous ghost boy at the school where I was eventually stationed, I was working hard to build up some custodial experience. Goodwill was offering training programs for a short list of career paths, and custodial work happened to be one of them. It felt like a perfect opportunity, but it wasn't easy. The program was challenging, far more than I had anticipated. I wasn't just learning skills, I was constantly battling with myself. There were days when the stress was so overwhelming that I thought about quitting. But something inside me refused to give up. I wanted to prove to myself that I could finish something, even when it was hard, even when it felt like the odds were stacked against me. That determination became my driving force. To complete the program, I had to adjust my entire schedule and routine. My morning started earlier than I thought possible, at 3 a.m. sharp. I dragged myself out of bed, get dressed, and head out the door to make it to Goodwill by 4 a.m. It wasn't glamorous, but it was necessary. Every day, I followed the same route, driving through the quiet, empty streets that seemed to stretch on forever in the dark. By that hour, the world felt eerily still, with only the hum of my car and the occasional streetlight breaking the silence. For weeks, everything about the drive was unremarkable. The darkness, the quiet, the stop signs, it was all routine. But one morning, that sense of normalcy was shattered. The air was colder than usual, and the darkness felt heavier, almost oppressive. I didn't think much of it at first. It was just another early morning on my way to training. As I approached a familiar stop sign, my headlights illuminated the intersection. It was then that I saw a cyclist, dressed entirely in light-colored clothing, pedaling steadily toward the crossing. I slowed down, instinctively preparing to stop. The cyclist had the right of way, so I waited for him to pass before continuing on my way. But as I sat there, watching and waiting, something strange happened. Or rather, nothing happened. The cyclist never crossed in front of me. At first, I thought maybe I'd missed him. Maybe he had zipped by while I was momentarily distracted. I glanced left and right, scanning the area for any sign of movement. There was nothing. No figure pedaling away in the distance, no one on the sidewalk. The intersection was completely empty, as though the cyclist had vanished into thin air. I blinked rapidly, trying to clear my vision, and muttered to myself, "What the—" My pulse quickened as I leaned forward, peering into the darkness beyond the reach of my headlights. But no matter where I looked, I couldn't find him. The street was as still and silent as it had been moments before. A chill ran down my spine, and my mind raced with explanations. Did I imagine it? Was it a trick of the light? Maybe the cyclist had turned off somewhere I couldn't see. But no matter how I tried to rationalize it, the image of that light-colored figure remained vivid in my mind. After a few moments of sitting there in stunned silence, I took a deep breath and decided to move on. I couldn't sit there forever after all. Slowly, I pressed the gas pedal and continued on my way, glancing in my rearview mirror every few seconds, as if expecting to see the cyclist appear behind me. When I finally arrived at Goodwill, I couldn't shake the eerie feeling that had settled over me. As I walked into the building, I was greeted by my training instructor, who immediately noticed the look on my face. "You okay?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. I hesitated for a moment, then blurted out, "I think I saw a ghost cyclist this morning." She chuckled at first, thinking I was joking, but when she saw how serious I was, her expression shifted. We talked about it for a bit, with her offering a few logical explanations. Maybe it was just someone who turned off before I saw where they went, or maybe it was my mind playing tricks on me in the early morning haze. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that what I had seen wasn't entirely normal. That morning stayed with me, haunting the edges of my thoughts as I went about my day. Even now, years later, I still think about that moment. the cyclist who seemed to vanish without a trace. Was it a ghost? A trick of the mind? I don't know. But whatever it was, it left a mark on me. A reminder that even in the most mundane routines, the unexpected can find us. I might have been around 11 years old at the time, and by then, it was just my sister and me still living at home. Life had changed a lot for our family, and with Dad working overnight shifts, we were often left alone at night to take care of ourselves. At that age, it felt normal. We'd fallen into a routine of getting ready for bed, locking the doors, and settling in for the night without giving it much thought. But sometimes, the normalcy of a routine can lull you into a false sense of security. The house was quiet that evening. I think we had gone to bed maybe an hour before everything happened. My room was directly across the hall from my sister's, and the only thing separating us was that short stretch of carpeted floor. It was comforting in a way, knowing she was so close. But that night, no amount of proximity could have made me feel safe. I remember it being incredibly dark, darker than usual. Maybe it was just the time of year or the lack of moonlight streaming through the windows, but the blackness outside seemed almost tangible. I was lying in bed, drifting in and out of that hazy state between wakefulness and sleep, when I heard it. At first, it was faint, just a slight rustling sound, like someone was moving something around. I didn't think much of it. I figured it might be the house settling or the wind brushing against the windows. But then it grew louder, more distinct, and impossible to ignore. It sounded like someone was rifling through something, a crackling, crinkling noise that seemed to echo down the hallway. It reminded me of Christmas wrapping paper or plastic bags, but it had a strange urgency to it, like whoever was making the noise was frantically searching for something. Occasionally, I thought I could hear what sounded like tearing, as if they were ripping through the material. I froze in bed, straining my ears to make sense of it. My first thought was that maybe my sister was up to something in her room. But why would she be going through plastic or wrapping paper in the middle of the night? It didn't make sense. Then, from across the hall, I heard her voice. "Stop!" she yelled, her tone sharp and angry. My heart jumped. Her voice startled me, not just because of the suddenness, but because of the emotion behind it. She sounded irritated, sure, but there was something else there. Something that sounded like fear. It took me a moment to process what she'd said and what she must have been thinking. She thought the noise was coming from me. I didn't even have time to fully register her words before I found myself yelling back, "That's not me." The second the words left my mouth, a wave of fear and confusion crashed over me. Saying it out loud made it real. It wasn't me, and it wasn't her. That meant someone, or something, else was in the house, making that noise. The realization must have hit my sister at the same time because the silence that followed felt heavy, almost suffocating. The rustling sound stopped as abruptly as it had started, as if whatever had been making it knew we were aware of its presence. I lay there, frozen, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my chest. My mind raced with questions. What had we heard? Where had it come from? Was someone in the house with us? I couldn't make sense of any of it, but the fear was all-consuming. Eventually, I mustered the courage to speak again, calling out to my sister to see if she was okay. Her voice trembled when she replied, and I could tell she was just as scared as I was. Neither of us dared to leave our rooms to investigate. Instead, We stayed where we were, talking quietly to each other, trying to reassure ourselves that maybe it was nothing. But deep down, we both knew it wasn't nothing. I don't remember much about the rest of that night, whether we eventually fell asleep or stayed awake until morning. What I do remember is how that fear lingered. For weeks afterward, I couldn't bring myself to sleep alone. I begged my sister to let me sleep in her bed, and thankfully, she didn't mind. Having her close by was the only thing that made me feel even remotely safe. Oddly enough, we never really talked about that night again. Maybe it was easier to pretend it hadn't happened, to push it to the back of our minds and move on. But my sister did tell me about another strange experience she'd had around that same time, and it only added to the unease I felt about our home. One afternoon, while I was outside playing, she was sitting in the living room, quietly reading a book. It was a calm day, sunlight streaming through the windows, the kind of peaceful atmosphere where nothing bad should happen. But as she sat there, engrossed in her book, she started to hear a faint tapping sound. Those experiences left a mark on both of us. Even now, years later, I still think about that night and the strange noise that filled our house. Was it just a figment of our imagination? A trick of the mind brought on by exhaustion or stress? Or was it something else entirely, something we couldn't explain? Whatever it was, it reminded me that sometimes the scariest things aren't the ones we see, but the ones we hear in the dark, when we're all alone and least expecting them. It all started on a cool evening. The kind of night where nothing exciting happens unless you make it happen yourself. My friend and I were out, feeling the thrill of teenage mischief coursing through our veins. Ding Dong Ditch had become our little adrenaline rush, a harmless prank, or so we thought. That night, we stumbled upon a house that seemed perfect. It had a gray minivan parked in the driveway, and the front gate of the fenced yard was wide open, almost inviting us in. We crept closer, trying not to make a sound. But as we approached the front door, we froze. Mounted above the doorbell was a Ring camera, its lens gleaming ominously in the dim porch light. My heart raced. No big deal, I thought, pulling up my hood to obscure my face. My friend did the same, and without hesitation he pressed the doorbell. The chime echoed through the house and we bolted, sprinting down the driveway and into the street. Our laughter turned to gasps as we ducked behind some bushes, crouching low to stay hidden. Moments later, the door opened and a man stepped out, flashlight in hand. He scanned the area, his light slicing through the darkness. We panicked. Before he could spot us, we dashed across the street to the next house and dove behind another set of bushes. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my ears. But then things took a turn we hadn't anticipated. The man must have seen us running because he went back inside, only to re-emerge moments later. This time, he climbed into his gray minivan. The headlights flicked on and the van began creeping down the street. My stomach dropped. This wasn't the kind of reaction we'd ever dealt with before. We scrambled to figure out our next move, but before we could, the van turned toward us. "Split up," my friend whispered harshly. Without thinking, we each darted in different directions. He ran to the end of the street while I ducked behind a dense row of bushes, holding my breath and praying I wouldn't be seen. The van rolled past me, its engine a low growl that felt unnervingly close. I peeked out, but my friend was nowhere in sight. I reached for my phone and saw multiple missed calls from him. Panic set in. Had the man caught him? My hands trembled as I dialed his number. To my relief, he picked up immediately. "I'm out of the neighborhood," he said, breathless. "Where are you?" "Still here," I whispered. "Stay low and get out when you can," he advised. I waited until the coast was clear and eventually slipped out of the neighborhood, sticking to the shadows. We met up a few blocks away, both shaken but grateful we were okay. "Let's not do this again for a while," he muttered, and I wholeheartedly agreed. The next day, the real consequences of our prank came to light. Word spread quickly around the neighborhood. Apparently, the man had texted several other adults about what had happened. My friend's parents sat us down for a stern talk. They told us someone had been ding-dong ditched the previous night, and that it wasn't just a simple prank anymore. The man who had chased us down the street, he had been carrying a gun. My blood ran cold as they explained what else had happened. That night, while we were running through the neighborhood, the man's 6-year-old daughter had come outside amidst the commotion. In her confusion and panic, she had run into a barbed wire fence, badly injuring herself. She had to be rushed to the hospital. My friend and I sat in stunned silence, the weight of what we'd done crashing down on us. We felt terrible. Our prank had gone so far beyond what we'd intended. A little girl was hurt, her family was shaken, and the man had been so terrified for his family's safety that he resorted to chasing teenagers with a weapon. The worst part? No one knew it was us. Not even my friend's parents suspected we had been the ones responsible. But we knew the truth, and that was enough to fill us with guilt. Looking back, I realized how naive and reckless we had been. What we thought was harmless fun had real, serious consequences. We decided then and there to put an end to our ding-dong ditching escapades for good. The thrill wasn't worth the risk, not to us, and certainly not to the people we had unwittingly hurt. I've been deaf my whole life, but that doesn't mean I'm disconnected from the world around me. I wear a hearing aid in one ear and a cochlear implant in the other. After years of speech classes, I've learned to talk and use sign language fluently. But being deaf didn't shield me from the most chilling experience of my life. It all started when I was in 5th grade. My grandma and I moved into a small apartment in a multi-unit house. It was cozy and charming, a 2-bedroom place with a bathroom, a cute little kitchen, and a window overlooking the driveway. The kitchen had a door that led up to the attic, a detail that didn't seem important at first. We lived upstairs while her boyfriend lived below us. At first, everything felt normal. The place even had this quaint charm to it. My grandma had an old radio she loved. It didn't work anymore, but she liked the way it looked and kept it on the kitchen table as decoration. But within weeks, things started to feel off. One night, I woke up suddenly. There was a loud noise. I couldn't make out exactly what it was, but it was so loud even I could hear it faintly in my left ear. I climbed out of bed, confused, and saw my grandma rushing down the hallway. I followed her to the kitchen, and there it was, the old radio. Its green light was glowing brightly, and the room was filled with harsh, crackling static. My grandma was trying to turn it off, but nothing worked. She signed to me, asking me to unplug it, so I checked. The radio wasn't even plugged in. We stood there, staring at it in disbelief, until it finally stopped. Around Thanksgiving, we decided to bring down some Christmas decorations from the attic. The attic was tiny and narrow, with a small window letting in just enough light to make the shadows seem even creepier. From the moment I stepped inside, I felt uneasy, like something was lurking in the dark. On the far side of the attic, there was a door. It was bolted shut, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was behind it shouldn't be disturbed. A few days later, my grandma was at work, and she asked me to go up to the attic alone. I didn't want to, but I told myself I'd be fine. When I got to the top of the stairs and opened the attic door, I froze. The bolted door on the other side of the attic was wide open. I felt a presence, like someone, or something, was watching me from the darkness. My heart started pounding, and before I could take another step, there was a loud thud behind the open door. That was all it took. I ran down the stairs as fast as I could, slamming and locking the attic door behind me. After that, everything escalated. I started waking up in the middle of the night, feeling like I was being held down. It wasn't sleep paralysis. It felt like hands were physically pinning me to the bed. The footsteps in the hallway got louder, and the walls would bang at random times, always coming from the direction of the attic. I tried to laugh it off with my grandma, joking that the ghost must know I'm deaf, but deep down I was terrified. Then my bed started shaking. It wasn't subtle. My whole bed would jolt, waking me up in the middle of the night. One night, I was startled awake by the sensation of something falling on me. I looked up and realized that 3 of my glass dolls, which had been sitting on a shelf across the room, had fallen onto my face. I had bruises for days after that. The final straw came from my grandma one morning. She woke up to the sound of her stepdad calling her by her nickname. He had passed away years ago when I was a little kid, but she said the voice was unmistakable. Even stranger, the smell of his old cologne filled the room. She could even smell coffee brewing, just like he used to make every morning. After that, we decided we couldn't stay there any longer. We moved out of that apartment as soon as we could, but the memories of what happened there have stayed with us. To this day, I still wonder, what was in that house, and why did it feel like it was targeting me? I have so many stories to share about my family. Stories ranging from unsettling encounters with strangers to chilling tales of skinwalkers. These experiences are too much to fit into one post, so I'll start here and might have to split it into 2 parts. Let me give you a little background. I live in a rural neighborhood in northeast Texas with my mom, dad, aunt, 3 siblings, and grandparents. That's 9 people under one roof, so you can imagine the chaos and energy in our house. We live on a ranch surrounded by wide open fields and dense patches of trees. It's a peaceful place, but sometimes the quiet can feel eerie. This first story happened about 4 years ago. It was a Saturday, around 2 p.m., bright and sunny, nothing out of the ordinary. My youngest sister had just been born and was sitting in her stroller about 5 feet from the front door. My siblings and I were in the living room, and my mom was in the kitchen, dancing along to some music while preparing lunch. The front door was wide open, letting in the warm afternoon breeze. From where we were sitting, we could see the open door, but not outside. Suddenly, my mom froze mid-step. She stopped dancing and stared at the door, her body tense. My siblings noticed and looked up too. "What's wrong?" I asked, confused. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she slowly turned to face the door, her eyes narrowing. "Hello? Can I help you?" she called out. My sister, sitting beside me, whispered, "Someone's outside." I leaned over to the window to take a look, but it was fogged up, so all I could see was a blurry figure. Not thinking much of it, I shrugged it off and went back to what I was doing. What I'm about to tell you now is what my mom told me later. She said she had felt someone watching her and turned to see a man standing just outside the door, his figure framed by the sunlight. He didn't step inside but hovered right at the threshold. She asked again, "Can I help you?" and started moving toward the door, instinctively pulling my sister's stroller further back. Every time she took a step forward, he took a step back, his eyes locked on hers the whole time. Then, he broke eye contact and started glancing around, his gaze settling on the unfinished flower pots near the porch. He asked, "Did your husband make those?" She told him yes, and he asked if her husband was home. Now, most people might think it was a mistake to admit he wasn't, but we weren't worried. We had a 50-pound German Shepherd and a 30-pound boxer mix, plenty of protection. She stepped closer to the door, and he stepped back again, raising his hand slightly as if to say he meant no harm. He told her he lived in a house that looked like a church a block away. He pointed in its direction. Here's where it gets creepy. That house was infamous in our neighborhood. The kids called it the vampire house because all the windows were covered with blankets and bars lined the doors and windows. It gave off an eerie, abandoned vibe. Without another word, the man started walking backward down the street, his eyes never leaving hers until he was far away. My mom quickly shut and locked the door. We haven't seen him since. The next story happened on our ranch while some cousins and my uncle were visiting. We were playing outside when we noticed two young owls perched in one of our trees. Now, seeing owls in Texas is rare, at least where we live, so we were curious. As dumb kids do, we decided to throw rocks at them. For some reason, they didn't fly away. Instead, they just sat there, staring at us, until we noticed they were bleeding. That's when my uncle saw what we were doing and yelled at us to stop. The owls finally flew away, and we thought that was the end of it. That night, as we were getting ready to start a fire, we noticed a woman walking toward our gate. She was filthy. Her clothes were torn, and she smelled terrible, like a mix of sweat and rotting garbage. My dad and uncle went to talk to her while we stayed back. When she saw my uncle, she grabbed his hand and held on tight, her nails digging into his skin. "Thank you," she said over and over again, her voice shaky. "For what?" my uncle asked, pulling his hand back. "For not letting them kill my children," she said. Her words chilled us to the bone. As she walked away, one of my cousins muttered, "Filthy rat." The woman froze. We were at least 80 feet away, and there was no way she could have heard him. But she turned to face us anyway. Her head never moved, but her body twisted as she walked away, as if she was keeping her eyes on us without turning fully around. CJ's story. This last story is about my mom's cousin, CJ. When CJ was younger, he was involved with the cartel. By the time he was 25, he had left that life behind and become a pastor. One day, he was walking to the store when he was pulled into a dark alley. A man started screaming at him in a language he didn't understand. Then, the man dropped to all fours and began crawling toward him like an animal. Before CJ could react, the man's body started to change. He said the man transformed into a wolf, lunging at him with its teeth bared. CJ dodged the attack, but the creature changed again, this time into a panther. The panther jumped on him, pinning him down and snapping at his face. In a panic, CJ yelled, "In Jesus' name, get this thing off me!" The creature flew backward, as if an invisible force had thrown it against the wall. It scrambled to its feet and ran away into the shadows. My mom told me that skinwalkers are people who have made contracts with the devil to gain the ability to shapeshift. She's been a Christian her whole life and firmly believes this is what CJ encountered. There are so many more stories I could tell about my family, but I'll save them for another time. It was an ordinary morning, or at least it started that way. I was on my way to school, as I usually was, at around 7:05. The air was crisp, and the streets were still bathed in the soft gray light of dawn. Wanting to avoid the rush and the noise of crowded streets, I chose a quieter, less traveled route. I've always preferred solitude, and this path, though somewhat isolated, gave me the peace I needed to prepare myself for the day ahead. The distance between my house and school wasn't far, maybe a 15-minute walk, but it felt longer that day. The streets were eerily quiet, and I didn't see a single person as I made my way. The houses along the route were spaced far apart, most of them old and a little run down, adding to the strange stillness of the morning. As I walked, my mind wandered. I was lost in thought, thinking about the upcoming day and what lay ahead, when I heard something that made me stop dead in my tracks. A woman's voice. It wasn't just any sound, it was a scream, raw and filled with despair. The cry pierced the quiet morning, coming from one of the houses up ahead. My heart raced, and I froze, unsure of what to do. The sound was so loud, so intense, that it sent chills down my spine. But then, just as suddenly as it began, the screaming stopped. Silence fell over the street, so complete it felt unnatural. The abrupt stillness was almost worse than the scream itself. My mind raced with possibilities. What had just happened? Why had it stopped so suddenly? I hesitated for a moment, standing there on the pavement, unsure if I should continue walking or turn around. My curiosity got the better of me, and I took a few cautious steps forward, my eyes fixed on the house where the sound had come from. It was an older building, its paint peeling and windows clouded with dust, but there was something unsettling about it. Before I could get too close, the front door swung open. A man stepped out. He wore a black shirt and jeans, and at first glance there was nothing unusual about him. But then I saw the blood. Dark red stains covered parts of his clothing, fresh enough to gleam faintly in the morning light. My breath caught in my throat. He looked at me. For what felt like an eternity, he just stood there, his eyes locked on mine. I couldn't move, couldn't think. Fear paralyzed me. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like they were made of stone. The man didn't say a word. He didn't make any sudden movements either. He just stared at me for a few moments, his expression unreadable, and then he turned and walked away. I watched him go, my heart pounding in my chest, unable to process what I had just seen. His calm demeanor made it even more chilling. He didn't hurry, didn't try to hide the bloodstains on his clothes. He simply walked away as though nothing had happened. Once he was out of sight, the fear that had frozen me finally broke. My body moved on its own, and I turned and hurried away, my footsteps echoing in the silence. I didn't dare look back, afraid of what I might see if I did. By the time I reached school, I was shaking. I couldn't focus on anything that day, my mind replaying the scene over and over again. The scream, the silence, the man with blood on his clothes. I didn't tell anyone at first. I didn't call the police. I told myself I was imagining things, that it wasn't my place to get involved. But as the days passed, I couldn't shake the guilt. 2 weeks and a few days have passed since that morning, and I still feel the weight of it. What if someone had been in danger? What if I could have helped, but chose to walk away instead? The questions haunt me. I still regret not doing anything. and the memory of that man's cold, steady gaze refuses to leave me.